"Don't drink the tea from this cup. The new mommy put poison in it." Penelope's words echoed in the kitchen, causing Richard Rodriguez to be surprised and make the decision to change the cups. It was early, the clock said 6 a.m. Richard was already up, as always. Since the death of his wife, Eduarda, 4 years ago, his routine had become a constant. Waking up, making Penelope breakfast, taking her to school and then spending hours at work. This repetition was what kept him going, as if any change could bring back the pain he felt when losing Eduarda. Penelope, now 4 years old, was the center of his life. Her big brown eyes were reminiscent of Eduarda's, bringing Richard comfort and sadness at the same time. He felt guilty about his wife's death, which occurred during childbirth. This guilt haunted him even as he loved his daughter deeply. There were moments when he saw her play or sleep, pain infiltrated his eyes, as if her presence was a constant reminder that he had failed to protect Eduarda. At work, Richard avoided any social interaction except what was necessary. He was an efficient and respected boss, but he kept a safe distance from his colleagues. It was rare to see him at events or having lunch with other employees. Everything seemed under control, but inside he knew he was just surviving, without really living. It was on a Wednesday morning, during a meeting with a partner company, that Richard's life began to change. In the conference room, he met Layla, a young assistant with brown hair and a welcoming smile. She was new to the company and her competence was remarkable, but what really caught Richard's attention was the calm way in which she handled pressure. Layla spoke to the most experienced executives naturally, gaining the trust of everyone around her. His eyes seemed to capture every detail of the room, and when their gazes met, Richard felt something that had been dormant for a long time stir within him. At first, he tried to ignore this feeling. There was no room in his life for new relationships or complications. However, as the days went by, Richard noticed Layla excelling in various situations. In a particularly tense meeting, she demonstrated a deep understanding of the project, helping to resolve a complicated issue that was holding up progress. Richard found himself admiring not only her intelligence, but also her ability to genuinely connect with people. One day, at the end of a long meeting, Layla approached him with a casual proposal. "If you need help with the reports, I'm available," she said, smiling. Richard hesitated for a moment, but eventually accepted. It wasn't just the need for help, but the curiosity about who this young woman was who seemed to understand the pain he carried, even without knowing him. As Richard and Layla worked together, a subtle change began to take place. She never forced personal conversations, but her questions were pointed, as if she knew exactly when to bring up certain topics. On one of those occasions, while they were working late, Layla made a comment that caught Richard by surprise. "You seem like someone who carries a very heavy burden. Sometimes it's good to share some of that with someone." Richard, a little disconcerted, responded evasively, but her remark did not leave him alone. Meanwhile, David, Richard's best friend and head of the marketing department, began to notice changes in his friend's behavior. They had a long-standing friendship, and since Eduarda's death, David had gone out of his way to offer support. He always encouraged Richard to go out more, to open himself up to new experiences, but his friend usually refused. However, upon noticing Richard's growing interest in Layla, David felt a hint of relief. Finally, maybe he's ready to move on, he thought. However, nothing would be that simple. Although Layla brought a lightness that Richard hadn't experienced in a long time, there was a part of him that resisted letting her fully into his life. The fear of suffering again and the guilt over Eduarda's death were significant obstacles. But for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, and it scared him. The first signs of change manifested themselves discreetly. Richard began to smile a little more, and even his posture seemed less tense. At the same time, conflicting feelings remained. There were nights when he woke up abruptly, taken by nightmares with the image of Eduarda disappearing from his hands, and fear consumed him again. However, Layla's presence was, little by little, planting a seed of transformation. Sitting in Penelope's room, Richard watched her sleep. The girl's eyes, closed in peaceful sleep, did not carry the weight of the world that he felt. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine a different future, a future where he could free himself from the past and, perhaps, allow himself to be happy again. But a doubt consumed him. Could Layla really be that chance for a fresh start, or just a temporary distraction from a pain that would never cease? Layla's presence became more and more constant in Richard's life. Workdays, previously marked by a silent and solitary routine, now included lively conversations and relaxed moments. They met frequently to discuss projects and reports, but these interactions began to extend beyond the company walls. The first dinner happened by chance, after an exhausting day in which the two had to resolve a crisis with an important client. Richard, surprisingly, offered to accompany her to a nearby restaurant. It was the first time in a long time that he allowed himself to step out of his bubble. During dinner, conversations flowed naturally. They talked about work, but also about life. Richard decided to open up a little during one of the dinners. He mentioned Penelope and how she filled his world. Layla listened intently, asking questions that demonstrated genuine but careful curiosity. Although there was no mention of Eduarda, the absence of her name was palpable, as if they both knew that bringing up this subject would be crossing a delicate line. Interactions between Richard and Layla became more frequent. They began meeting after work for casual dinners, and Richard found himself looking forward to those times. He was still struggling with his own feelings, trying to maintain a safe emotional distance, but he felt that barrier beginning to crumble. There was something about Layla, a calm, almost therapeutic presence, that made him feel at ease, like he could, perhaps, let his guard down, even if just a little.
It was at one of these dinners that Layla asked a question that caught him off guard. "Would Penelope like to meet me sometime?" She said with the casual tone of someone who just suggested something without any pretension. Richard hesitated for a moment. Introducing Layla to his daughter felt like a significant step, one he didn't know if he was ready to take. However, he ended up agreeing. "We can arrange something over the weekend," he replied, trying to sound nonchalant. When the day arrived, Layla appeared at Richard's house with a naturalness that he hadn't expected. She was dressed in casual clothes and had in her hands a small doll wrapped in colored paper, a gift for Penelope. Richard tensed, not knowing how his daughter would react to the new presents, but, to his surprise, Penelope accepted the gift with a shy smile. The three spent the day together at a park, where Penelope played while Layla and Richard watched. There were moments of silence, but they weren't uncomfortable. They were filled with a tacit understanding, as if they both knew that something was transforming there. As his relationship with Layla increased, Richard began to have flashbacks of his life with Eduarda, simple moments, like him and Eduarda dancing in the living room or her laughing after a bad joke. These memories were sweet, but they also carried a bitter sting, reminding him of what he had lost. Now, next to Layla, he found himself trying not to compare moments. She was different from Eduarda, and the way she made him feel was also unique. Richard didn't know if he was allowing himself to love again or just trying to fill the void that Eduarda had left. One quiet afternoon, as Layla helped Richard prepare dinner, Penelope approached with a question that made Richard's heart sink. "Can she be my new mommy?" asked the girl, with the innocence of someone who doesn't understand the depth of what she was saying. Layla remained silent, seeming to not know what to respond. Richard, with a lump in his throat, just smiled and hugged her. "It's too early for that, darling," he replied, not knowing if he was speaking to his daughter or himself. Despite the uncertainties, the relationship between Richard and Layla continued to grow stronger. The conversations became deeper, and he began to realize that he felt less guilty about opening up to someone else. There was one night in particular when, upon dropping Layla off at her house, he hesitated before saying goodbye. For a moment, he thought about kissing her, but pulled back, feeling confused. Layla noticed, but didn't pressure him. He just smiled and wished him a good night. Richard's conflicting feelings began to manifest themselves more intensely. He would wake up in the middle of the night, overcome by betraying his memory by approaching Layla. On one of those nights, when he saw a photo of Eduarda on the bedside table, he took it in his hands and remained silent for a few minutes. "Forgive me, Eduarda. I don't know what I'm doing," she whispered, with tears in her eyes. Meanwhile, Layla showed special care for Penelope. They began to form a genuine bond, and the girl seemed to enjoy having her around. Layla's interest in getting closer to Penelope didn't seem forced. On the contrary, there was a naturalness in his gestures that made Richard believe that perhaps life was giving him a new chance at happiness. In the moments when he allowed himself to relax, Richard began to imagine what it would be like to have Layla definitely in their lives. Although he was still haunted by doubt and fear, there was also a spark of hope, something he thought he had lost forever. On a quiet evening, Richard and Layla were sitting in the living room, having put Penelope to bed. The conversation flowed like so many other times, but there was tension in the air. Layla slowly approached and held Richard's hand. At this moment, he felt all his worries melt away. He leaned forward, and this time he didn't flinch. Their lips touched in a soft kiss, filled with uncertainty and desire. For Richard, it was an important step and perhaps the beginning of a new chapter in his life. However, he knew that leaving the past behind would not be as simple as a kiss, and the next steps could reveal feelings and secrets still hidden. As the months passed, the relationship between Richard and Layla consolidated almost naturally, as if an invisible force was guiding them towards that new phase. Richard, who had previously been hesitant to open the doors of his life, now found himself building a routine with Layla and Penelope, forming a family nucleus that he didn't expect to find so soon. Moving into Richard's house was a decision that came with time. Layla was already spending most nights there, and the transition seemed inevitable and comfortable for everyone. The new routine was a breath of life in the house, where silence previously dominated. Layla helped prepare breakfast, took Penelope to school and even started decorating the rooms with touches of color, transforming the previously impersonal environment. For Penelope, Layla's presence has become an essential part of her day. The girl followed her everywhere, absorbing the affection and attention that Layla generously offered. She became increasingly fond of her new motherly figure, affectionately calling her Moon, which melted Richard's heart. Little by little, he felt the weight of his own sadness lift. At night, when Penelope was in bed, Richard and Layla would spend hours talking, laughing, or simply enjoying each other's company. He began to believe that life was finally giving him a new chance to be happy. Layla's easy smile and constant presence created a feeling of stability he hadn't experienced since the loss of Eduarda. It was as if she had returned to that house the warmth that had been lost. However, not everything was completely perfect. Small details began to emerge, initially insignificant, but little by little they formed a mosaic of concerns. Sometimes Layla would receive phone calls that left her tense. She would go away to talk on the phone, always with vague explanations about work or family problems. Richard noticed the change in his tone and the way he quickly ended calls when he approached. He chose to ignore the signs, convinced he was just being too paranoid or overprotective. However, the first time that distrust began to take concrete form was on a Saturday afternoon. Richard was in the garden arranging some plants, while Layla and Penelope played in the living room. Suddenly, he heard an altered tone of voice coming from Layla, who was speaking on the phone. He couldn't understand what was being said, but the intensity of his speech caught his attention.
Before we continue, I need to tell you something amazing. Do you want to attract a lot of money into your life? Learn how to do it with the secret content that I will leave in the first pinned comment, and start transforming your financial life. Let's continue.
When he went back inside, he saw Penelope sitting on the couch with a confused look. "Daddy," Lua was angry on the phone. "She said she wasn't supposed to call again," said the girl, with the innocence of someone who didn't realize the gravity of what she had just reported. Richard smiled reassuringly and hugged her. "She must have been upset about something at work, dear." "Nothing for you to worry about," he replied, trying to ignore the feeling of discomfort that was beginning to emerge. Despite the unsettling occasions, Richard chose to focus on the positives. Penelope's happiness, who seemed more lively and talkative since Layla came into their lives, gave him comfort. The house, now more vibrant and full of life, offered a glimpse of a future he hadn't considered possible for a long time. At night, the three of them had dinner together and played board games in the living room, laughing and sharing moments that were almost as natural as those Richard had lived with Eduarda. However, there was something different. While Eduarda was like a ray of sunshine, with an always present and contagious energy, Layla brought a softer, comforting and almost silent warmth, which welcomed without invading. One night, as Richard was getting ready for bed, he heard Layla's voice in the hallway, speaking softly on the phone. The bedroom door was half open, and he could only hear fragments of what she was saying. "I already told you I'm dealing with it. Don't worry, everything will be fine." Upon realizing that Richard was there, she quickly ended the call and tried to hide it with a smile. "It was just an office problem, nothing you need to worry about," she said. Richard, intrigued, did not press for answers. He wanted to believe that Layla's explanations were enough. The fear of ruining the life he was beginning to rebuild prevented him from asking too many questions. He needed to believe that he had finally found a new chance to be happy and that any worry was the result of a mind still marked by tragedy. After all, he had already lost so much, and now he just wanted to have something to fight for. The emerging tension increased when, on another occasion, Penelope commented something strange again. During dinner, she casually asked, "Layla, why did you say someone had to disappear?" The comment made Layla pale for a moment, but she quickly recovered and smiled. "Ah, honey, you must have heard wrong. I was talking about the project at work, nothing important." Richard, upon seeing Layla's evasive reaction, felt a pang of uneasiness, but quickly dismissed the thought. There were no concrete reasons to distrust her. Maybe it was Penelope acting out an adult conversation without understanding the context. Still, doubt began to plant its roots. Richard found himself torn between fully trusting Layla and questioning the evidence that was accumulating. He struggled to stay focused on what really mattered, Penelope's happiness and the possibility of a new beginning. Layla seemed to be the chance at redemption that Richard needed so much, someone who brought color and life to his existence and who was a mother figure to his daughter. During the night, Richard, lying next to Layla, watched her sleeping. The full moon illuminated the room through the window, casting soft shadows across her face. He reached out and touched her hair affectionately, but the slight discomfort of his suspicions remained. He wondered if he was really ready to fully trust another person and if it might just be him sabotaging his own chance at happiness. However, he decided to ignore the warning signs and trust that things were going in the right direction. He closed his eyes and forced himself to believe that what he found next to Layla was worth it. After all, after so long lost in darkness, he finally felt able to glimpse the light. Little did he know that that light would still bring shadows that he could not predict. The next morning, Richard woke up with a feeling of anticipation fluttering in his chest. He had made an important decision. He would ask Layla to marry him. In the final months, she would become a vital presence in his life, someone who not only filled the void left by Eduarda, but who also brought new meaning to his days. The love he felt for Layla had grown and consolidated quickly, but it seemed to have deep roots. He believed it was the right time to make their relationship official and take a step towards a future together. Richard spoke to David, his best friend, who was excited about the idea and suggested that the proposal be made during a surprise dinner at Richard's country house, a quiet and special place where he and Eduarda used to spend some weekends. The suggestion initially made Richard reluctant, but he ended up giving in, convinced that this would be the perfect scenario for the beginning of a new phase. As the preparations progressed, small events began to disturb the apparent serenity that surrounded the couple. Some objects began to mysteriously disappear around the house. First, it was Penelope's favorite bracelet, then, a ring that belonged to Eduarda, kept with care in a drawer. Richard initially thought it was carelessness or that Penelope might have played with the items and lost them. However, when Layla casually commented that she hadn't found her wallet at home one morning, he felt a growing uneasiness. If that wasn't enough, Richard received an anonymous message that added to his apprehension. The email, with no sender identified, simply said, "Do you really know who is next to you?" The text was direct and chilled Richard's blood. Although he tried to ignore the warning, the words echoed in his mind, reigniting the doubts he struggled to bury. Determined to share the incident, Richard sought out David. The friend listened to him carefully and, after a moment of reflection, said, "Richard, this is nothing. It must be someone trying to scare you or intrigue you. If you really love Layla, don't let an anonymous message get in the way of what you is building." Firmly, David added, "Life has given you a second chance. Take advantage of it." Richard nodded, trying to convince himself that David was right, but deep inside, the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't go away. He began to pay more attention to Layla's movements, analyzing her gestures and expressions with an intensity he had never had before. However, whenever he tried to find something suspicious, he was greeted by a loving, caring and sincere Layla, which made him question whether his suspicion was nothing more than unjustified paranoia. Proposal week arrived, and David helped organize the romantic dinner at the cottage, overseeing every detail, from the flowers to the soft candle lighting. When Richard and Layla arrived, the weather was perfect. The night was cool, with a light breeze that ruffled the leaves of the trees, and the sky dotted with stars seemed to embrace that moment. During dinner, Richard felt his heart racing. Penelope had a babysitter in town, so he and Layla had the whole night to themselves. Waited for the right moment to place the order. When Layla took his hand across the table, he knelt beside her, taking a small blue velvet box from his pocket. "You transformed my life, you brought joy where there was pain before. I no longer want to imagine a future without you by my side. Will you marry me?" Layla's eyes filled with tears and, smiling, she responded enthusiastically, "Yes, Richard. Of course I do." They hugged, and Richard felt a wave of relief and happiness wash over his body. For a moment he believed all his worries were unfounded, maybe David was right and he really was sabotaging his own happiness. However, something disturbing happened while they were still at the cottage. Richard went to get a bottle of champagne from the kitchen and, when he returned, he saw Layla on the phone, speaking quietly, almost as if she wanted to avoid being overheard. She quickly ended the call when she saw him enter the room, but the discomfort he felt couldn't be ignored. It was something important. He asked, trying to sound casual, "Everything okay, love?" Layla smiled, but there was a trace of tension in her eyes. "Nothing you need to worry about, love. Just a quick call from work." Richard nodded, but the evasive answer didn't reassure him. He wondered who she could be talking to in the middle of a celebratory night and why she seemed so cautious about that call. When he returned home the next day, another surprise awaited him. An envelope with no return address had been left in his mailbox. Inside was a photo of Layla with an unknown man in a place Richard didn't recognize. On the back of the photo, a note, "Be careful who you trust." Richard stood there for a few minutes, holding the photo with a mixture of anger and confusion. Who was trying to sabotage your happiness? Was this an attempt to ruin what he had built with Layla? He decided to keep the photo in a drawer, determined to investigate the matter discreetly. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't ignore the warnings either. Although the marriage proposal was a success, Richard's uneasiness remained latent. He tried to convince himself that everything was just coincidences and that the photo, as well as the anonymous messages, could be the work of someone jealous. However, he couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was approaching, something he still didn't fully understand. Richard wondered if he was prepared to move on without the answers he needed. The proposal had marked a new beginning, but he couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, the past and the present were about to collide, bringing to light secrets that could change everything he believed about Layla. Now the challenge was to decide whether he would fully trust the woman he had chosen to be his wife or whether he would listen to the disturbing echoes that were beginning to surround him. It was an ordinary afternoon, apparently peaceful, when Penelope entered the kitchen with her eyes wide and her voice shaking. "Daddy, Layla," she began, interrupting Richard, who was preparing dinner. He stopped immediately when he saw his daughter's condition. "What happened, Penelope?" he asked, worried. "She was talking on the phone. I heard her say she was going to put poison in your tea," said the girl, trying to hold back her tears. "I said you were supposed to sleep, or worse." A cold sensation ran through Richard's body. He held onto the counter to keep from losing his balance. At first, he didn't want to believe it. Was it possible that Penelope had gotten confused? But as he looked at his daughter, the seriousness in her eyes and the memories of recent incidents, the mysterious phone calls, the disappearing objects, the anonymous messages, made his heart race. Although a part of him refused to accept it, Richard knew he needed to act. Later that night, when Layla entered the room with 2 cups of tea, Richard did his best not to show his anxiety. "I made us some tea." "It's a cold night," said Layla, with a gentle smile. Richard watched carefully as Layla placed the cups on the table and turned to grab something from the counter. It was at that moment that he acted quickly, switching the cups. When Layla returned, Richard was already sitting, holding the cup in his hands and trying to appear calm. They chatted casually for a few minutes, until Layla took her first sip. The reaction was almost immediate. She dropped the cups suddenly, as if she had been burned, and held her stomach with a pained expression. "Richard, I'm not feeling well," she said, starting to lose her balance. Richard ran to support her. Her face was pale and sweat was running down her forehead. He quickly called an ambulance, and Layla was rushed to the hospital. At the hospital, while Layla was being treated, Richard tried to process what was happening. The woman he loved, whom he had planned to marry, was now in critical condition. He didn't know if Layla had really tried to poison him or if it was all just a terrible misunderstanding. But Penelope's suspicions, recent events, and Layla's reaction to the tea seemed to confirm her worst fears. It was then that David appeared at the hospital, with a serious expression on his face. Richard approached, eager to understand what was happening. "What are you doing here, David?" he asked, voice tense. "Layla called me before you brought her to the hospital. He said he needed help." "She told me everything," replied David, with disturbing calm. Richard frowned, not understanding. "Did you tell me everything you're talking about?" David sighed and finally revealed the truth that Richard could never have imagined. "Layla is pregnant, and I am the father of the baby." The revelation was a direct blow to Richard's gut. He felt his legs weaken as betrayal and anger rose within him. But what David said next made the whole story take an even darker turn. "Do you think what Layla did was on her own? She was following my instructions the entire time," David said, his tone thick with bitterness. Richard looked at him, not knowing how to react. "You never knew, Richard. But I loved Eduarda. We had been friends since college. I always hoped she would choose me. When she got with you, I tried to put it behind me. I tried to be your friend and forget my feelings. But when she died, everything turned to resentment. I envied you for so long. Her death was the last straw. I couldn't accept that you still had everything, the company, your daughter, while I had nothing." David's words sounded surreal in Richard's mind, but at the same time, everything began to fall into place. Layla's strange phone calls, the disappearing objects, the anonymous messages. You manipulated Layla into getting closer to me?" Richard asked, disbelief and anger mixed together. "Yes," David confessed, coldly. "I convinced her to approach you and gain your trust. She was perfect for the role, young, beautiful and ambitious. He didn't resist when I offered him money and promises of a better life. The plan was simple: make her marry you, poison you to make him unable to continue running the company, and then take control with her help. And of course, Layla and I would be together." An overwhelming anger took hold of Richard. Everything he believed to be happiness with Layla was nothing more than a farce. He felt devastated but determined not to let David get away with it. "You will pay for this, David." "I swear it will," he replied, voice firm. As David walked away, a bitter smile appeared on his lips. "Good luck with that, Richard. Layla has nothing to lose now." Richard glanced at the emergency room door, where Layla was still being treated. He knew that from now on, nothing would be the same. All the trust he had placed in her, all his hopes, had been destroyed. He felt betrayed by two of the people he trusted most, and the pain in his chest felt unbearable. When Layla was finally released for visitors, Richard entered the room and found her pale, with a blank look. "You did all this to destroy me?" he asked, voice cracking with sadness and anger. Layla looked at him, her eyes full of tears. "I didn't want to, Richard. I swear. But David manipulated me. He said this was the only way we could have a life together. I was weak." With a heavy heart, Richard took a step back. He didn't know if she was telling the truth or if it was just another attempt at manipulation. From that moment on, he realized he needed to step away. There was no more room for excuses or second chances. He had lost what he believed to be his new chance at happiness, and now all that was left was to deal with the pain of having been betrayed and protect his daughter from the harm caused by this plot. As he was leaving the hospital, Richard realized that, once again, life was forcing him to start over from scratch. But this time, he would do so knowing who his enemies really were. The news of David and Layla's betrayal echoed in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Betrayed by two people he trusted, he felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under his feet. The pain was not just from the plot that had almost destroyed him, but from the feeling of having been so completely deceived. He wondered how he could have been so blind, ignoring the signs that, in retrospect, seemed so obvious. Determined to put a definitive end to that story, Richard took the first steps to separate himself from Layla. He began the process of annulling the marriage that had never been made official and cut off any type of communication with her. Richard made it clear to David that he no longer had a place in the company. Any trace of friendship had broken down, and he was already taking steps to remove David from his position and revoke his access to any important company decisions. While Layla recovered in the hospital, Richard focused his energy on rebuilding his life and protecting Penelope. He knew that recent events had left their mark on the girl, who was now showing signs of fear and insecurity. Penelope had witnessed more than any child her age should, and Richard felt an urgent need to provide her with the stability and love that had been temporarily shattered. To do this, he decided to seek professional help, both for himself and his daughter. Therapy sessions began to surface issues that Richard had long avoided facing. He was once again faced with guilt over Eduarda's death, a pain he had never allowed himself to overcome. For the first time, he opened up about how much he blamed himself for failing to protect her and how that shaped his relationships. The therapist helped him realize that the tragedy that befell him was not his fault. Eduarda had died from complications during childbirth, and not from anything he could have done or failed to do. Little by little, Richard began to accept that the guilt he carried was unfair and unnecessary. This process of forgiving himself was painful, but necessary for him to genuinely move forward. Over time, Richard and Penelope began to find peace again. They spent more time together, and Richard dedicated himself to providing his daughter with happy moments to make up for what she had experienced. Visits to the park, playing in the garden and reading at night became strengthening rituals for both of them. Little by little, Penelope's smile became more frequent again, and she began to regain the confidence she had lost. Richard also learned to deal with grief in a different way. He finally understood that moving forward did not mean forgetting Eduarda, but rather finding a way to honor her memory by living a full life, not marked only by pain. She decided to keep Eduarda's wedding ring in a special box along with some photos of her and happy moments. It wasn't goodbye, but a way of acknowledging that, although she would always be part of his story, he needed to make room for new possibilities. Richard's life did not miraculously turn into something perfect. The traumas and scars remained, but he had learned to deal with them. Disillusionment with Layla and David taught him to be more cautious, but it didn't make him give up believing in people. Over time, he discovered that the most important thing was to be honest with himself and not be afraid to face the pain of the past to build a better future. The painful cycle that began with Eduarda's death was finally closing. Richard didn't know what the future held for him, but for the first time in years, he was at peace with himself and his choices. He had learned to forgive not only those who betrayed him, but especially himself. Now, the only certainty I had was that, regardless of the challenges that arose, they would face them together. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you liked it, leave a like, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any more stories like this. Comment below what you thought of the video. See you next time.